Springtime is coming, and I'm sure like me, you've got a lot of areas that are empty and ready to put plants in, or perhaps it's your first year and you're not sure what to do in terms of preparing the bed and what are perhaps the best ways to prepare a bed before sowing or planting into. So in this video I want to cover all of the core things to think about and techniques and methods to ensure that whatever you do sow, whatever you do transplant, gets off to the best start possible. We're coming out of winter, which means the hungry gap is approaching. So I've got a few crops to help cover that. Here is some purple sprouting broccoli, which will be hopefully producing in maybe 2 or 3 weeks. But the rest of the garden is ready for those new crops that we can enjoy in late spring and summer. And there's 3 things that you've got to ask yourself as we're coming out of winter when it comes to the condition of your beds. The first consideration is thinking about when the bed was last mulched with compost. Because I follow no-dig principles, I usually put around 3 to 5 centimetres of compost over the surface of a garden bed every single year. If it's been over a year, you might want to consider putting at least 2 to 3 centimetres of compost over the top. The second consideration is, what is the weed situation like in a raised bed? Are there a lot of weeds? Is it relatively clear? Before putting down any mulch, if it's needed, just weed the bed so you're starting with a nice blank canvas. It's really good for your headspace as well, looking at a raised bed and not thinking, oh no, I've got to do some weeding. And the final consideration to make before sowing or transplanting is to actually think back to the previous growing season. What crop was growing there? Did that crop suffer a particularly bad pest or disease? Because that could still be active in the ground. For example, I had carrots here that at the end succumbed to some carrot root fly. So I know this year I don't want to grow carrots here again, but I'm happy to grow anything else that isn't going to be affected by that pest. Once you've taken those 3 considerations into account, it's time to now think about how to prepare beds before sowing directly. At the moment, I'm only sowing undercover because it's still a bit too early. However, it's not early to start getting my raised beds ready for sowing in around 2 or 3 weeks. So moisture in the soil is one of the most important things for germinating seeds. If it's dry, the seeds simply won't germinate. Outside, here in a temperate climate here in the UK, at this time of year, I don't need to worry about my raised beds drying out. However, you do have to be a little bit careful with raised beds undercover. The problem with beds undercover is that there's no rain. Rain can't come through, and because often less is happening and growth is a lot slower in winter, it's easier to forget about these, and the soil can actually dry out. So what you want to do is, say, if you're going to be sowing into your beds in your polytunnel, you actually want to make sure that there's a good amount of moisture in the soil beforehand. And there's a certain watering technique that I use to make sure that it is nice and ready for sowing seeds and making sure that they germinate. The best way to rehydrate a dry raised bed is to actually do it over a process of a day. What you'll find is that if you just put on a lot of water, it'll start pooling and running off rather than going down. What you want to do is approach it in a slow and steady way. You want to give it a good water, leave it for 10-15 minutes, come back, give it another good water, and keep repeating. So I'd maybe put 10 watering cans over the course of maybe 2 hours on this bed, and then I'll cover it with cardboard and leave it overnight. Then by the next morning, I'll remove the cardboard and I'll go down, and chances are there's going to be a really nice spread of water going downwards. And then what you'll find is when you give it another water the next day, the water is going to go straight down into the ground where you want it. Now during March or April, there's often a period of 1 or 2 weeks where we don't actually get any rain. And this is where some of your beds might start drying out. What I'd simply ask is either you can water them and deal with it, or actually wait for some heavy rain and then sow into those beds afterwards, because a week's difference isn't going to make too much. Chances are when you have really dry weather, you're going to have clear nights, so it's going to be really cold in the night. So you might want to wait for that warmer air temperatures in the evening to come, which usually brings rain, to then do your first initial sowing of the season. When you're sowing directly into the ground, you want a nice kind of prepared surface, which makes it easy for you to create seed drills or trenches, which means everything's got to be the right layer, and you also don't want like stones and fibrous bits of compost in the way, because it just holds you back. So what I do is I like to create a tilth. When it comes to rakes, I use the back of the rake a lot more than the actual teeth of the rake, because I find it much easier to start creating a level surface. So what I do is I just push it all out, create a level surface, and then once I'm happy with that, I'll very loosely along the top skim with the teeth, and what that does is it captures all of the bigger bits that I can just skim over into a corner and then place that onto the compost. So then I'm left with this beautiful light, fluffy, friable growing medium, which I can then start creating some seed drills ready to sow seeds in. It just makes life a lot easier. If you've just mulched a bed with compost, you don't really need to make a tilth. You just need to make sure that it's fairly flat and even, just so when it comes to seed sowing depth, it remains fairly constant. This bed here, I've actually mulched with Rocket Grow. It's a compost brand that I'm an ambassador of this year, and I'm going to be putting it through its paces to see how it does. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this bed, where I'm going to be transplanting and direct sowing using Rocket Grow compost, is going to perform. And I've got a bed in the polytunnel as well, and you'll see how this kind of performs during every single garden tour that I'm going to do this year. So this is some chives that I brought last year, and I forgot to put them out, and you can see the amazing root structure, and it's definitely a bit root bound, but that's okay. But transplanting, I find, is a lot easier and simpler when it comes to bed preparation compared to sowing. You don't need to create a tilth because you're not having to create nice rows. All you're doing is placing plants directly into the ground. If you're planting something in singular holes, for example, this garlic is around 5 centimeters, 2 inches deep, you don't actually need to bother creating a tilth anyway. All I did to prepare this bed was put over a light surface mulch of compost, and then I went in and planted the garlic in their individual holes. It's as easy as that. When you're transplanting a seedling into a bed, you've got all of this compost which is holding on to water, and then you water it in after transplanting. And what you can actually do is, if the bed is fairly dry, you can get away with not having to water the whole bed. Just water around where the seedlings are, and then all you need to do is wait for some heavy rainfall to do the rest. You can always mulch them if you want with a little bit of extra compost, but it's really rather simple in terms of transplanting and bed preparation. As long as it's got some compost on that I've put in within the last 6 to 8 months, I am more than happy planting straight into it and not worrying about anything else. If you happen to suffer from slug damage, there's a technique that you can start implementing today, weeks before sowing or transplanting, and it's great if you know that you're going to be transplanting something that is very prone to slug damage like lettuce here in a week's time. Use this method. All you need is some kind of big board like this. You place it on the ground like that, and what you'll find is if you come every morning and turn it over, chances are you're going to find slugs hiding underneath it. It's a perfect habitat for slugs. So if you get a nice big plank like this, or a nice big slate or stone, and do this every week, what you're going to do is actually capture a lot of the slugs within this vicinity to remove them before the plants and the tender seedlings come. And it's a great way to actually help prepare this area and the surrounding area for your plants this springtime. During the growing season, it's a little bit different, because if you're preparing to sow or transplant something, chances are you've just cleared that bed of a particular crop. So you don't need to really worry about weeds. You've probably already given it a mulch of compost either the autumn or spring beforehand. So all you want to do is actually leave as many of the previous crop's roots in the ground. That helps to contribute to soil health. maybe just give it a little rake, but then just put plants in it straight away, whether you're going to direct sow, just work around the roots that are still in the ground, or transplanting something. It is much easier because usually when you have a crop growing and covering the surface, it acts as a living mulch, so you don't have to worry about the soil being dry either, because the beds aren't exposed to the elements. What I want you to take away from this video is that bed preparation for sowing or transplanting it's really simple. That's how it should be. Gardening is a very simple process. Obviously, a big part of it is that idea of mulching with a layer of compost. And if you're struggling to create enough compost for your garden, you can never have too much homemade compost. And I've got this video here, which shows you 8 great free ingredients to bulk up your compost bin so you can make a lot more to help nourish your garden and your plants.